Welcome back. Today's class we will discuss about bilateral contracts model and also hybrid model of restructuring of power systems. In the last video lecture we have come across the different types of restructuring models. We have discussed in detail about the Poolco model, who are the players in the Poolco model, how they function, and in particular the role of independent system operator in the Poolco model. And also at the end, we have seen about the contracts for differences, which plays a major role in modern day Poolco models. In today's class, we will discuss about bilateral contracts model and also hybrid model. So I hope that by the end of this lecture, you will be able to compare the three restructuring models and choose the better one based upon the requirements. Now, let's start with the bilateral contracts model. In the bilateral contracts model, as we all know that there will be two major players in the power markets. One who basically sells the power. Those are called as GENCOs, and DISCOMs, those who are ready to buy the power. I am ignoring the customers, the large customers who can directly purchase from the GENCOs. So I am considering that GENCOs are the sellers of electricity and DISCOMs are the buyers of electricity. Now, in bilateral contracts model, the trading of electricity is basically negotiable, and it is negotiable between the two parties who are ready to buy and sell the electricity, and they will make an agreement between these two, what we call it as a contract. Since a contract is between the two players, it is called as a bilateral contracts model. So all the contracts or all the trading will be done between two parties, where the terms and conditions of the contracts, they will be set by the two parties itself. And the independent system operator or other operators, they won't have any word regarding this. They won't interfere in the contracts which are being set up between these two parties. That's why, since the buyers are able to directly access the sellers and the sellers are directly able to access the buyers, this model is also called as a direct access model because of direct accessing of both parties. So a buyer can freely access the sellers, and a seller also can easily access the buyers. And as already said, the customers also, apart from the DISCOMs, the customers also, if they are willing, they are free to contract directly, or what we call it as a bilaterally, with the GENCOs. Now, by establishing appropriate access and also a proper pricing standards, the customers transfer the purchased power as restricted to power transmission and distribution or utility wires. So there will be no obligation for a single centrally dispatched regional power pool. So all the contracts will be bilateral, and there is no need of any power pool in this particular model. Now the key features in this particular model is that since a trading has been done between the two parties itself, the prices, the quantity and the delivery points all have been worked out between the two parties itself. So the role of ISO, independent system operator, is very limited in the case of bilateral contracts model. Earlier we have seen in the Poolco model where the ISO was responsible for collecting the bids, finalizing the MCP, looking after the technical limitations and allowing and permitting non-discriminatory access to the transmission lines. So he looks after the dispatch of the electricity, he collects the money, he does all the financial settlements. So the role of ISO is very large in case of Poolco model. But whereas in case of bilateral contracts model, the role of ISO is very limited because the pricing, the delivery points, the quantities all have been decided between the parties itself. So the role of ISO is very limited because the buyers and sellers, they can negotiate directly. So on what? Regarding the price, regarding the quantity which they want, and regarding the delivery points. So dispatch also will be the timing also, at what time they want. So all these things, they will be taken care by the buyers and sellers itself. So the ISO role is very limited. And as already been said, the major parties here will be discos and gencos. And let us suppose customers who don't want to buy from disco, they can form a group. Aggregated customers. So the customers, they may get aggregated. They may choose a person who represent them, and he can directly negotiate with the genco. So this will benefit these customers rather than buying from the disco. They may get a reasonable price from the genco if they contact directly. So small customers aggregation is essential to ensure that they would benefit from the competition. Now, these are the key features of bilateral contracts model. The first thing is the role of ISO is very limited, and the buyers and sellers, they will negotiate directly, and to get better price, it's better to aggregate for the customers. Now, what is the procedure involved in this bilateral contracts model? So, as already been said, the price of electricity and the quantity of electricity, the volume of electricity which is to be transferred, and the delivery points and the timings, all will be settled by the bilateral parties itself. So now the gencos and the discoms, now what do they want? Agreement has been made that, let us suppose there is an agreement that this guy is supposed to deliver some amount of power, let us suppose 200 megawatts of power at 5 rupees per unit from 6 AM to 6 PM on 25/8/2022. Now agreement has been made on the paper. Now it's time for delivering the power at that time. So what he needs a separate transmission system. So these suppliers, they will request the transmission system for providing access to the transmission lines. And for accessing the transmission lines, they will pay transmission charges or wheeling charges, whatever you call it. We will discuss in detail about these things in unit number 2. So the suppliers, basically the genco people, since they have made an agreement, so they will contract the transco to provide access to the transmission lines, and for that they will transmission charges they will pay. Transmission charges. And apart from this, see, wholesale suppliers would pay transmission charges to a transmission company to acquire access to the transmission grid. And maybe let us suppose if there is a distribution system also, let us suppose if customers have purchased the power from the genco, so they need to access this transmission system, and also sometimes they need to access this distribution system also. So they will be paying for those things, for both. Now, in this model, a distribution company may function as an aggregator for a large number of retail customers. So normally discoms, basically they act as independent entities, but in remote areas they may act as aggregators also. That we will discuss in the next class. So a distribution company may function as an aggregator also. Now, the generation portion of a former integrated utility may function as a supplier or other independent generating companies, and transmission system would serve as a common carrier to contracted parties that would permit mutual benefits and customers' choice. So a transmission system would serve as a common carrier to all the contracted parties, and any two contracted parties would agree on contract terms, as already been discussed. So what will be there on the contract? Price, quantity, locations, and who is supposed to provide? Generation providers. Let us suppose this genco is having a large number of companies. Let us suppose you take TSNco, It is having nearly 25 plants spread across a vast area of the state of Telangana. So, which generating company out of this GENCO, out of this number of units, which unit is supposed to deliver the power? So, all this will be there in the contract terms. So, all these contract terms will be informed to the TRANSCO and in particular to the ISO, Independent System Operator. So, Independent System Operator will finalize the transmission line access, right? So, all this price, quantity, locations and generation providers will be provided to ISO, and this ISO, after receiving the information about this delivery, the schedule of generators on when they are going to deliver, based upon that he will give access to the transmission lines. Moving ahead, now in this type of markets, what is the role of ISO? So basically the ISO, he ensures that sufficient resources are available to finalize the transactions so that the system can be held reliable, the system can be maintained reliable. So ISO basically ensures that sufficient resources are available, and he provides non-discriminatory access to the transmission and distribution systems. If distribution systems are also available, then he will provide non-discriminatory access, but most of the times he will limit himself to transmission system only. So for that one, he charges some amount, so what we call it as cost-based transmission pricing. So he charges some amount, transmission pricing, and with that he will provide non-discriminatory access. And what are the advantages of this bilateral contracts model? As long as the power network is not constrained, which means that there are sufficient number of generators and sufficient number of transmission lines are available, the pricing scheme is perfect, because as the constraints arise in markets, we have seen in the last class, the prices will be varying a lot. But if we make a bilateral contracts, then irrespective of the market, then we will get the quantity, then we will get the electricity at a fixed price for a longer duration. So independent of the markets, the pricing scheme looks perfect as long as the power network is constrained. Let us suppose if the generation units are less in number, then automatically there exists a competition. So basically they want to move to the market where they will get a higher price. But if everything is available in large number, the GENCOs and DISCOMs, and there are no constraints in capacities, then it's better if we go for bilateral contracts. Now the disadvantage in this is the biggest disadvantage. Now this is not the big disadvantage. Now system users who lose in the bidding process would have to find other power providers to supply their loads or modify. Let us suppose if a person is not able to get, actually this is a disadvantage of pool-co model, unnecessarily I have written here. In the pool-co model, basically what happens is if you are unable to find any bidder, basically then you are supposed to move on to finding some particular buyer for your electricity. Let us suppose if I am a GENCO, I am in pool-co model, and if my bid is not selected, then automatically I should go out because I have power available with me. So I must go out and I must search some party so that I can sell my power. So that is a typical task in a pool-co model, which is solved in this bilateral contracts, because in bilateral contracts model I'll be having a long-term agreement with the seller. So based upon my requirements, based upon the demand, I will be able to provide my electricity. And the biggest disadvantage of this bilateral contracts model is that it's a tough task. Basically, if I'm a new entrant, if I don't have any proper relations, then it will be tougher for me to find buyers or to find sellers. So for new entrants, basically pool-co model is preferred. Whereas for old people who do have large portfolios, then it's better if they go with a bilateral contracts model. Now, we move on to the next model, hybrid model. In the hybrid model, basically what happens is we take the features of both bilateral contracts model and we also establish a pool model basically. So the customers will be having two options, whether they can sign bilateral contracts or they can choose the supplies from the pool, which means that the GENCOs and the DISCOMs, either they can have direct relation, or they can select with the help of a pool. So two options are available, which means that utilizing the pool operation is not mandatory, but the pool will serve all the participants, buyers and sellers. So those who are not ready to sign bilateral contracts, they can go to the pool and they can purchase the power and they can sell the power. So two things are available basically for in a hybrid model basically. So one such example is the California power markets. California in USA basically it maintains both the power markets, both pool model and also bilateral contracts. So if you are willing to purchase power directly from a Genco, then you are free. If not, you can come to the pool and you can purchase power at the market clearing price. So what is the advantage of this maintaining this hybrid model is that, so rather than having a mandatory pool where only the person who is ready to provide power at a lower cost, only he will benefit in a pool model. Whereas in a bilateral contract model, it is difficult for a new entrant to find relations, so that in order to search for so many people, choose a perfect one and maintaining contracts, it is tough task for a new entrant. So these disadvantages are overcome in a hybrid model basically. And one more thing is, if a person, as already said in the pool model, let us suppose if a person who is a part of pool model, if he maintains his contracts for differences, then he will automatically get benefited. He will get a stable price, even though there is a change in the markets. So, but then what is the disadvantage of hybrid model? But before going with the disadvantage of hybrid model, so first of all, we will see the procedure basically, how basically the procedures will be there in the hybrid model, how this Gencos and Discoms, how they do operate in a hybrid model basically. See, let us suppose there is a Genco. One and let us suppose Genco is having 250 megawatts of power and it is providing some 100 megawatts here and 250 megawatts here. So it is having a long-term agreement with these two Discoms to provide 150 megawatts of power. Now the remaining 100 megawatts, what they will do is nothing but they will buy from pool. Sorry, they will sell through the pool. So the remaining 100 megawatts, what they will do is nothing but they will come to the pool, they will submit the bids and they will be selling their power. So this is what happens if we do have a hybrid model. So you can maintain your bilateral contracts and you can go to the pool. Now let us suppose if these Discom, now let us suppose if he needs suddenly 100 megawatts. So automatically what happens, he has got already 50 megawatts from Genco 1. Let us suppose if the demand is too low, instead of asking him, let us suppose if he is purchasing at 5 rupees and 5 rupees. The remaining 100 megawatts, let us suppose Genco is selling in a pool. Now this Discom basically is already having 50 megawatts requirement. He is already purchasing it from Genco 1. Now he needs 100 megawatts. Now if he asks directly Genco 1, what he will say, he will directly ask him to pay 5 rupees. So he may go to the pool. If the demand is too low, then he may get the power at a very lower price, at 3 rupees, let us suppose. So this is the advantage of having a hybrid market. So both the Gencos, they will go to the pool, if whatever the leftover energy which they do have after this bilateral contracts, they will sell their power here. And any Discoms basically, any buyers basically, the remaining power which they require or any certain requirement is there for them, then automatically they will go to the pool and they will purchase the power there. So the existence of the pool can efficiently identify individual customers' energy requirements and simplify the balancing process of energy supply. See here, the balance is being provided. Otherwise, if there was no pool, then automatically it was difficult for this guy to sell this power. Similarly for the discoms also. So the advantage of having a pool in addition with the bilateral contracts helps in balancing the energy supply and demand. Now what are the advantages and limitations? So the buyers and sellers both, now they are having multiple options. Either they can go with bilateral contracts or they can utilize the pool. But what are the limitations? It is very difficult task and it is very costliest thing to maintain two separate entities required for operating the PS and also for the transmission system. Because in the transmission system, the ISO will be having multiple problems because he has to ensure the access to the transmission lines for bilateral contracts people, and also he has to ensure the transmission access to the winning bidders in the pool. So it is a little bit tedious task and also a costliest task. So I hope now you are able to understand the different things, different restructuring models, pool co model, bilateral contracts model, and the existing of both the models, what we call it as an hybrid model. So the choice of choosing a model, it is a policy decision generally made by a country, and it is more dominated by the prevailing conditions which do exist in that particular country. So before adopting these things, there must be some structural changes, because developing a pool model requires establishing a pool and maintaining it properly. Whereas in a bilateral contracts model also, you do require an independent system operator for providing transmission access, non-discriminatory transmission access. So depending upon the policy makers, any model can be adopted based upon the requirements. Okay, so that's it from my side. So I hope now you are able to understand the different restructuring models and compare them and choose the better one based upon the requirements. And these are the lecture level questions. I hope you can go through these things. Thank you. We will meet again. In the next class, we will discuss about the role of independent system operator. Thank you.